Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Building in Solutions for Anticipated Challenges in CAR-T Development Programs. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Worldwide Clinical Trials who developed the content for this presentation. Worldwide Clinical Trials is a leading full-service global contract research organization, CRO, that works in partnership with biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies to create customized solutions that advance new medications from discovery to reality. Anchored in the company's scientific heritage, they are therapeutically focused on cardiovascular, metabolic, neuroscience, oncology, and rare diseases. Their deep therapeutic knowledge enables them to develop flexible plans and quickly solve problems for their customers. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Amy Raymond has dedicated more than 25 years to drug discovery and development, including positions in clinical operations and clinical strategies in CROs and in biotech, with a focus on rare diseases across all therapeutic areas. Currently, she leads the Cell and Gene Therapy Hub at Worldwide Clinical Trials, partnering with drug developers and clinical operations teams. Amy has completed her doctoral training in molecular biology and postdoctoral training at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Jacob Boyd has amassed more than 10 years of experience in clinical development project management, with a focus on innovative oncology products such as CAR-T therapies and gene therapy. He has worked across all clinical phases with a specific emphasis on early phase projects. Jake has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from East Carolina University. Missy Green brings more than 9 years of clinical research experience with a focus on oncology. Prior to her CRO career, she served in patient care at Rochester General Hospital and coordinated clinics at Children's National Hospital. Missy holds an MBA in Healthcare Administration and a bachelor's degree in International Relations. And Daniel Perez, with more than 14 years of experience in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, has held various roles in health administration, clinical operations, and strategic business development. He has led the implementation of over 40 clinical trials and graduated summa cum laude from Southern California University of Health Sciences. He is also a certified clinical research professional from SOCRA. And now, without further ado, let's go ahead and hand things over to our first speaker for today. Amy Raymond, you may begin when you're ready.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Raymond. As Ryan says, I am Therapeutic Strategy Lead here at Worldwide Clinical Trials, focusing on cell and gene therapy programs with our drug development partners. Thank you so much for tuning in today. The content today really grew organically out of the conversations amongst the team here, discussions that we're having internally as we set the strategy on the next program, discussions with our partners, and then discussions on how do we evolve the strategies in the face of, evolution, continuing trends in technology and the landscape. Our hope is that everyone here with us today has a chance to take away insights or perspectives that can be applied to your next CAR-T program. So before diving in to the deep end with our CAR-T operational experts, I wanted to pause here on the front end and provide just a little bit of context, especially for our counterparts who might be newer to the CAR-T arena. As it grows, there's more folks coming on board, but even for our folks who maybe aren't newer, but have been understandably heads down, focused on doing the important work of your individual programs. So we don't mean to suggest that there's one easy recipe and that it could be applied to every single program. We here have been fortunate to be part of many, many programs of the last decade, and it puts us deeply in touch with the truth that cellular immunotherapy programs can sometimes be some of the most complex ones to execute well, efficiently, successfully, there's so many different layers to that. So from the typical challenges, if you will, of drug development, needing to contain timeline and budget while maintaining recruitment and retention, that's not easy for any program. But layering on top of that, the complexities we see with cell and gene therapy programs like CAR T, when we're working with patient populations with high unmet need, the timeline and budget implications for the long-term follow-up portion of the program, because while we're all looking for durability, it can be both a very, very good thing or potentially dangerous thing. That's what the follow-ups are all about. And then on top of that, navigating the evolving framework, right? That means everything from how to satisfy regulators in multiple regions, meeting the more recent FDA guidance on doing our very, very best to make sure that trial populations really mirror the actual patient population, and satisfying payers to help drive maximum access following market authorization. And realistically, we just have to expect that the framework will continue to evolve because it's trying to keep up with the rapidly evolving technology and modalities, right? So on that very topic, I occasionally get asked, CAR T, there's so many of them out there already. Surely we're not, right? We're certainly not. The focus of this hour really will be on CAR T, but it's worth pointing out that we're seeing a steady uptick and innovation in this space. Some of it being innovation to the CAR T approaches being taken, and other innovations which could have the potential to impact the environment for CAR T trials in the very near future. Right now, there are 6 CAR T products available as the standard of care, shown along the bottom row there, adjacent to the green text, all being used ex vivo autologous products, labeled for a small handful of the B-cell malignancies, and these really have changed the paradigm a bit for families that are facing multiple myeloma, ALL, DLBCL, any of the other B-cell malignancies covered by the labels. But we know, right, we're not done. There's additional innovation that's really needed to overcome the inherent barriers there. Some of them are inherent limitations to any autologous ex vivo drug products, the sort of things that keep treating physicians today from prescribing it more often. Things like the logistics of having a patient travel what can be a considerable distance from their home to a treatment center to go through that inpatient delivery and the whole vein-to-vein journey as a family. Things like the perceived financial burden on the patient family, especially in the face of questions they may have about durability of the treatment. But the newer modalities really do aim to bring solutions to things like, how do we reach solid tumors well? How do we harness the innate immune system for more of that durability and less evasion? How do we best combat the tumor microenvironment, overcoming T-cell exhaustion, on and on and on. And so those few examples of those innovations are shown in the upper right quadrant here. And those are things like the allogeneic CAR NK programs that you're probably reading about from teams like Gamida-Cell, Atara, as well as the allogeneic CAR T. It's still a CAR T, but it's a different flavor from what we would call traditional CAR T. And isn't that kind of a fun phrase, even just a few years into this? As well as in vivo autologous CAR T from makers like Ansoma with an adenoviral vector program, as well as the lentiviral vector program from Sana, and TCR programs from teams like Adaptimmune and TCR2. Those innovations, we hope to lead to improvements in efficiency. And we're all aiming for safe, effective, innovative treatments, but maybe just importantly, some of these innovations can also help the field as a whole overcome practical barriers at the commercial stage, with treating physicians citing barriers like that reluctance to prescribe based on patient distance, financial implications, and whether they catch that patient in their right window in their own journey. So, what are some of these trends? I mentioned an uptick in some of that innovation. If we look at other forms of adoptive cell therapy, such as TCR, a lot of excitement, CTL, the natural killer cells, and TILs, in some ways, sort of the stalwart of adoptive cell therapy, what we see is over time, as you look left to right, we see that uptick in the number of programs per year. And that's it's not nothing. I mean, it's some of these, it's 20 to 40 starting per year, which is significant, cause for hope. We're definitely looking forward to readouts from those programs. But we do keep in mind, these do represent just a smaller proportion still of that overall adoptive cell therapy. When you plot the CAR T starts per year on top of the data we just looked at on the last slide, you can see CAR T remains very much the dominant modality today. Not that there isn't cause for hope, because that does itself continue to evolve. So taken together, sorry for that, we recognize that when we say CAR T, it doesn't mean just one thing the way it used to, or if you look at just at the standard of care, and that it's an evolving space. Attributes impacting operations, things like, is the program autologous? Is it allogeneic? I know initially we all had some concerns about allogeneic products, but with recent results like we're seeing out of Allogene that are positive, there's still a lot of cause for excitement in that space. A great application of the gene editing technologies that have continued to evolve, one of many ways they're being applied in this arena. As well as operationally, what does it mean for an ex vivo product like we're used to seeing versus an in vivo product? You know, where does that take the program in terms of potential reach outside of the major KOL centers eventually? In addition to looking at blood cancers versus solid tumors, shown here on the right is a year-over-year starts in the solid tumor space. You can see there's continuing growth in that area, and some of it is, you know, how do we do a better job of targeting surface antigens, that sort of thing. Plus, at a program level, you know, I'm personally excited by the innovation of things like the recent guidance on how can we trial multiple versions of a product against each other early on in an umbrella. And I think those kinds of innovations are really going to help us collectively bubble up some of the most powerful, effective treatments. But there are a lot of different nuances, flavors, elements to any of the programs, all of which have to be taken into account for the best strategy for each individual program. But here, we've come together to share with you some of our lessons. For that, I will pass the microphone over to our operational experts, Jake and Missy.
Thank you, Amy. You know, Amy, as you just highlighted for us, there are a tremendous amount of CAR T studies moving into the clinic, especially this year, which makes it even more important for sponsors to be thinking earlier in the process, really about a holistic strategy to model their protocols for to be successful in the clinic. That's going to include making the protocols appealing for investigators and obviously reducing overall burden on the patients that are agreeing to participate in these types of therapies. You know, as you know, the overarching goal is to ultimately get the IP or technology to the market approval stage. So, you know, based on what my colleague Missy and I have experienced over the past few years as we've worked with various sponsors on these types of programs, we wanted to really frame the different areas that you know, that need to be considered when these strategies are being developed, and you know, speak to you all a little bit today about what needs to be kept in mind. You know, many sponsor teams already have dedicated teams in-house to work through many of these areas, which is fantastic. But for many of the companies Missy and I have worked with in helping them operationalize these protocols in the clinic, we've developed a playbook to kind of structure those conversations and you know, gives everyone a venue to provide their own insight, which is where your CRO partner can really be a huge benefit. You know, as you know, the CRO is able to help with certain pieces that everyone may not be familiar with. You know, and just to run through these a little bit, one of the first pieces to handle is going to be confirming the operational considerations for your product and bringing on an experienced team, well versed in the types of vendors that need to be included, and that's gonna really include manufacturing partners, specialty labs, even the most appropriate EDC vendor. Those all need to be considered up front. And then there are many clinical sites well versed in handling these types of products already, but due to the competitive landscape, especially in the US, but it's really across the globe. And pairing that with lean resources at many sites these days, careful considerations for the sites to collaborate with becomes even more important, especially for earlier phase protocols that only needs a small number of patients to meet endpoints. I know my colleagues Avi and Daniel will be speaking more shortly around the diversity and inclusion aspect of our presentation, but I did want to note that it doesn't only apply to a diverse patient population, but also the inclusion of community-based centers that may not at the moment be as well versed in CAR T research, but will absolutely be important to expand into as research into the area continues to grow. And then for logistics management and data-driven strategies, everything from selecting the right manufacturing partner or partners, multiple, including slot management, as well as realizing that the bolus of data collected to make critical decisions for these types of trials is going to be really prior to the first infusion through around 28 days. So that's going to affect the type of monitoring strategy you implement on your study. And these are all heavy-hitting strategies to work out from the beginning, obviously. But without stealing too much time from my colleague, Missy, I want to turn it over to her to walk through some of the challenges she's experienced and what she's done to resolve those.
Thanks, Jake. So I've worked with a lot of different sponsors and studies, and these are just a few of the challenges that we've found, and I want to talk through them in the lessons that we've learned. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think there's some really key things that we can pull from this. So one of the sponsors I worked with was talking to a research consortium, very popular, brought a new idea. So they went ahead and they contracted them for 15 sites. And through a few months into the study, we found that they weren't able to really fulfill on that contract for multiple reasons, which ended up extending out the site activation. So it was adding on to our timeline, which of course impacts how much you guys, the sponsor, spending on this study. So we took it back, and the solution was we brought all of the sites that were with that particular vendor, we brought them back into Worldwide, and we were actually able to open all of the sites plus the additional sites that they weren't able to find in a very timely manner, so that we could bring the timeline back to what we expected it to be and what we planned for it to be. So that lesson learned when we were sitting down and speaking as a team was, what can we learn from this situation? I think we always are looking for ways to expedite things, and this was a really good idea on paper, but I think what we learned was, hey, we need to make sure that we're really going in and looking at these vendors. I mean, do they have that track record that we're looking for? Going beyond just that checklist that we work with our vendor management with. So we really focused on looking at vendors and building up our vendor portfolio, right? There are vendors that you want to use as sponsors that we're happy to work with you with and vet. And then there are some that your partnering CRO can bring on that they've worked with and that they can provide that experience with. As Jake also talked about, one of the bigger tasks that we have to account for when we're looking at cell and gene therapy is the logistics coordination. It's kind of what everyone looks at when you go into the clinical realm of things. So coming into it, I think we have a lot of questions of, what does that look like? I think it's different at every partner and CRO. I think it's different at every sponsor. I think there's a little bit what they're looking for is slightly different. So here at Worldwide, we've been able to look at that role and change it. And so what we found works the best is to have a dedicated logistics coordinator. So really what that means is from the time that the patient is identified until the time that the patient is treated, there is one particular person who will be looking at that patient, making sure that whether it be the apheresis product, whether it be the final product, is getting where it needs to be. And it's a one-stop person for the sponsor to go to, as well as the CRO team. So essentially it's that gatekeeper. We can go to that one person, and then we have what we call a cohort tracker, which is a tool that we use here that tracks all of this information so that we can give metrics out, because this is what we're looking at for enrollment, what we need to change. It also feeds into slot allocation and different clinical decisions that we need to make as we're assessing risk across the study. And then the last piece that I wanted to bring up is we know that CAR T has a lot of information. It's very data driven, especially in the beginning. So when we were looking at that, we wanted to make sure that our clinical teams are addressing that. And furthermore, it's changed. The climate has changed with COVID, because sites really aren't letting us on site anymore. Some aren't at all. Some are meeting somewhere in the middle where we can go over 3 months. I think there's one site that actually lets us on once a year. So there's different approaches across different sites. So we needed to look at that, and we wanted to make sure that we were presenting a solution to our sponsors that was getting what they needed. So what we came up with is we use a targeted SDV module. And therefore, so when we look at it, this is very dependent on what sponsors need. If you want to go ahead and you want to do 100% SDV, we can build that in. If you only want to do a 65% or 30% SDV, that's completely customizable. Furthermore, if we are doing targeted SDV and we don't have our hands on all the data, we want to make sure that we still have that level of insight with the data, but also with site issues. So we use a program called TriOpera. It's our clinical monitoring system. So we can set up KPIs. So we have standard KPIs as well as custom KPIs that are built into the system. And by doing that, we have monthly metrics that come out. And this is really where we can sit down as a team, as a CRO and sponsor, and we can look at, hey, what do we need to change? Is there a specific patient that needs to be SDV'd 100% due to safety issues? Is there a site that has a lot of site issues, so maybe we need to spend more time there? Is there another site that maybe we can pull back on because they're a well-running machine? We don't have to worry as much. We just need to look at the very critical data. And by doing that and changing our approach, depending on the patient and the site, we're able to provide a higher level of working with the sites and making sure that you're getting what you need out of the information in the data and making sure that it's quality. So there are a lot of other risks and solutions that we're working with. I know that there are probably some questions and we would love to take them later on. But now I'd like to turn the time over to Daniel Perez, and then Daniel can talk about the solutions in bringing a lot of the diversity and inclusion to the cell and gene therapy space.
Thank you, Missy. First and foremost, it's a pleasure and privilege to have found a home at Worldwide Clinical Trials, where we are very forward in thinking to the impact of diversity and inclusion requirements that we see with recent legislature. So what I want to spend some time here over the next few slides is really talking about how we are architecting and thinking through the upcoming challenges that the diversity and inclusion guidelines expected to become requirements as early as next year are going to have in the impact, not just on the drug development landscape, but most importantly, the impact we're going to have on the future generation of patients. And so for us, one of the things that we are thinking about is access issues and how we can make and prime commercial aspects of making these products available in a wider demographic. And so for me specifically, I want to talk about the market uptake risk factors. We have the positive impact that is altruistic in nature and is beneficial to patients everywhere to ensure that these products are efficacious and, to Amy's point, mirrors and is representative of the real world. At the same time, we do have uptake risk factors that diversity and inclusion, when applied strategically and operationally, can actually help to mitigate these risk factors. And the first one is the limited geographic reach. We know that we have a very limited geographic reach currently in terms of where these clinical trials are able to operate and where we are selecting sites. Of course, we also are approaching the same sites and same investigators by nature of the expertise, by nature of the fact that we are, of course, working to get these products. To your point, Jake, the ultimate goal is to get these products across the finish line and to get them into the market. And then really looking at the fact that our investigator population, they are getting older. We are not activating de novo sites nearly as fast as the demand is increasing for new sites. And we have, again, an ability, or the ability here, to increase our geographic capacity if we're thinking and planning ahead. Next slide, please. In terms of the design mode, again, we are looking to assemble and architect and design ahead of time right now proactively. We want to consider that the wider geographic of these clinical investigation sites will prime for a stronger commercial launch. As Amy pointed in the slide, we do have products in the market. We do have a competitive pipeline coming through. we're going to want to really think through the ability of our clinical operations team in terms of trial delivery, our ability to enable greater access for patients of underserved communities, and also the diversity of socioeconomic ability to participate in these trials. Again, this is a risk mitigation strategy for commercial failure that ensures efficacy. We have seen examples of products that come into the market, and unfortunately, they don't work for diverse communities. And so we see FDA requirements coming through mandating post-phase 4 clinical trials. And of course, there are the short-term impacts and strategies we can deploy for diversity and inclusion. And then there are the long-term ramifications of not doing so effectively that may impact your commercial success. So what are these approaches? Let's speak very practically. Of course, we are in the design phase of our solutions, as is the entire industry as a large. The industry as a whole is looking at developing and designing novel approaches to enrollment strategies. There isn't one tried, true, and tested model that's going to work and move the needle on diversity and inclusion. But also, let's be very clear. The FDA is not expecting perfection. The agency is not expecting very specific targets to be met. The agency's been very clear on their requirements for the submission of diversity action plans, regardless of whether or not these studies are going to meet the criteria for waivers. And so it's in the development of these diversity action plans that we want to talk through some of the potential solution approaches that we can take for the future direction of our studies. And the first one, of course, is something we have been doing for some time now, which is the design of the patient's voice in our recruitment material, but really looking at and beyond not just cultural competency, but really how are we going to meet patients where they're at? Where are these patient recruitment materials going to be positioned where we are actually reaching a wider and broader demographic? And of course, what is the role of non-trialist clinicians, the folks and the clinicians providing care across the entire spectrum of a patient's journey? How do we support them in educating them in what clinical trials are in terms of their participation of their patients, and of course the availability of clinical trials that they can refer patients out to. Time and time and again, we see patient panels and diversity and inclusion topics discuss that they would be more than happy and willing to participate if they were simply asked, if their clinicians were just well versed in the ability to explain a clinical trial. There are solutions that we can deploy to educate and engage non-trialists in the clinical trial operations project planning. We also want to take a look at what it may require to operationalize clinical trials in community-based sites that are not your traditional academic centers. There is a way to look at the composition of existing team members and how they can play a role in the delivery of the clinical trial without the need for the traditional burdens that may come with becoming GCP certified, protocol training, lab training, et cetera, and then having to be chased down for every version of a protocol and sign off on these things. You're talking about community-based sites that are already overburdened, overworked, primarily Medicaid and Medicare providers that cannot be able to bring on highly specialized researchers. I'm not saying that we compromise on quality, and of course we must be compliant with the regulation. However, we can get creative in our ability to engage non-research specialists in those community-based centers in how they provide delivery of the clinical trial. And then I think another important aspect for us to consider is the role that the caregivers are providing. It's not only the patient that's taking time off of work, is making the time commitment, but also their caregivers, the people in the support systems around them. Time and time and again, we see patient recruitment material being very targeted towards patients, but we don't necessarily see them come into the support groups of the patient's families, the patient's caregivers, and also what role can we have in the patient caregiver in terms of advocacy and the design of recruitment strategies. So of course we have patient engagement that can help design and help input and have consulting on our clinical project delivery and our recruitment material. But I would love to see the role of the caregivers, the ones who see things from a different perspective on the side of their patient, of their loved one, in terms of how they're being guided through the clinical trial process. So these are just some of the examples of the solutions that we are architecting, that we are thinking about, that we are pressure testing in the lab, if you will. They are incubating for the future deployment that we would like to see in our programs. And again, I want to really highlight that we're here at Worldwide Clinical Trials thinking about the impact that this is going to have, not just for the patients and the well-being and efficacious application of these products, but also more importantly to ensure a robust commercial success for these products commercializing into the market. And of course, one of the biggest aspects that I want to address here is all of these solutions come together to help close access gaps. It's about bringing patients closer to the trial, having the trials meet patients where they're at. And for me, it involves a multifaceted approach that's going to span patient recruitment, clinical operations, regulatory strategy. You're also going to want to engage at the earliest possible point. I encourage folks to not think about diversity and inclusion planning at the stage of your trial conducting. I want you to all consider partnership at the very early stages in the design of how you're thinking about this product entering the market. Again, we want to look at the role of non-trialists, building referral bridges to our non-participating centers, and looking for ways how we can extend those capabilities from the participating sites over to reaching a more diverse and inclusive patient population.
Daniel, just, something that I wanted to expand on a little bit is, I love this idea of bringing in, non-clinical trials and what that looks like. But there are some real implications that as clinical teams we think about. An example is a DOA, right? How many times have we all sat in audits and we've gotten that minor ding because that DOA wasn't 100% what it needed to be, or that one phlebotomist wasn't on the list, but she took it for this patient. So can we kind of maybe talk around some of the solutions that we're talking and trying to put through to change the attitude within the auditing perspective of this?
Yeah, so I think including regulatory compliance by design is something that I particularly hold very near and dear to my heart. And I want to encourage folks to not shy away from really reading the regulations, really digging deep and questioning how things have been done. There is the precedent of being risk averse and ensuring that we are doing things in the most conservative way. And then there is the regulatory flexibility that the FDA has been very clear on with regards to industry guidance around 1572 and the role of the delegation of authority log, the role of ancillary staff who do not necessarily meet the criteria for performing highly specialized research procedures. These are folks who are, these are professionals who have been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years at a time. One would argue that they are qualified by training and education to perform the duties that they are being asked to do. Now, in terms of making this airtight for agency audits, again, we need to be able to tell a story from A through Z and connect it to the guidance that we have access to from the FDA. Specifically, there is guidance around the 1572 that the FDA released that states that ancillary staff, such as medical assistants, nursing staff, administrative staff that can perhaps help with scheduling or coordination logistics, they do not meet the criteria for significantly delegated research protocol procedures. And so therefore, they need not be listed on the 1572, the delegation of authority log. However, the agency is going to want to look at some sort of reference material that is going to be able to tell the story that that is indeed what you are doing, whether it is an SOP that you help guide sites to develop, that they are able to clearly connect and reference those guidelines, whether it is the ability to file in your regulatory documents such SOP or reference to a policy. Again, the agency is looking for thoughtful approach to novel solutions. We saw this in the advent of decentralized clinical trials. We saw this in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. The agency is not going to come down harshly on the solutions as long as we're thinking about them in a thoughtful way, and we're also referencing and working within the framework of the guidance that they've issued. So there are ways to approach this in a thoughtful manner. And there's balance. Of course, there's balance to not delegating highly specialized research protocol procedures over to non-trialists, but at the same time, is it truly feasible to come to a community-based hospital that perhaps has a float pool of 20 plus medical assistants or phlebotomists and be able to come down and say, we can't activate that site because their 20 phlebotomists are not GCP certified? I mean, there's a balance with how we, at the CRO and sponsor level, we have a particular responsibility in our ability to erase access pathways by means of being too strict in our ability to select sites and qualify sites. So, you know, I think for me in particular, one of the things I like to do is just challenge our project delivery teams and our regulators to really take a hard look at what the guidance has done in the past and how we can interpret them in the future. And again, engage the experts, really tap the regulatory experts. We're not here to you know, operate under my interpretation at all, and by any means you engage the right folks, dot the I's and cross the T's. And again, with the recent diversity and inclusion guidance, the FDA is going to want to see new solutions. They're going to encourage the exploration of new solutions. So again, open dialogue with the agency, open dialogue with our sponsors, and really making sure that we are taking care of patient safety as a North Star.
Thank you, Daniel. And, you know, I know we all made the choice of what we could include in the conversation today and what we couldn't. But on this very topic, I think we've all been struck by the parallels, what you're talking about here in terms of regulatory flexibility, freedom, allowances, and how that also comes out in the recent DCT guidance. You know, hybrid decentralized approaches for oncology ATMP, that's a newer application, but is that same message being repeated by the regulators there as well? Like what is protocol-driven expertise versus what is a standard of care kind of activity that I think is really helping us, you know, reshape the site selection, site success process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. So Missy and I are going to go a little bit more in depth and give you guys a few examples of tools and systems we've implemented on CAR-T studies to help alleviate some of the obstacles we've encountered during our time working on these studies. And that's going to include the secure transfer of PHI, which is particularly important with studies involving autologous cell products. Certain plans and manuals like logistics plans, cohort management plans that aid in providing guidelines to all of the parties involved when it comes to logistics and managing the assignment of enrollment and manufacturing slots to patients, and really providing a structured communication platform for all team members to be operating on the same page. But that being said, Missy, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks, Jake. And moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about our first tool. So one of the tools that we found is really important is a portal for PHI. So within this particular space, PHI is very different because it has to be on the product, it has to be on the apheresis, it has to be in a lot of different places. So it's a new, we're learning as we go. We're following the regulations, we're making sure that it's in the correct documents, right? It needs to be in the ICFs, it needs to be in discussions with the particular patient, but also internally looking at, you know, are we sharing the bare minimum, or are we doing our due diligence to make sure we're protecting it the best that we possibly can for our patients. So here's below on the slide is talking about, we've done a few studies. We've done one that we had a portal that securely did transfer PHI, and then we had one without. We still followed regulations. We were still able to securely send it, just not with a particular portal. Without that portal, there were some incidents of PHI breaches that we had to go back and we had to fix. That portal just really kind of took that risk right out for us, because we have the ability to give the sites and vendors, if needed for temporary time, access to this information. So your CRO can control that. If you would prefer to keep it at a sponsor level, you could control it as a sponsor as well. So we're really making sure that the information that needs to be shared is shared, and everything else is protected as it was intended to be. Furthermore, the other issue that we run into with PHI is, you know, on any other study, any non-CAR T gene therapy study, everything goes in the TMF. right? Everything has to be stored. We want to deliver it. This is incredibly important. But when we're talking about this particular space, that's no longer applicable because we can't have PHI in the TMF. So it's also looking at, okay, so we need to protect the information, but once we protect it, how are we going to store it so that we meet regulations? So having the secure portal not only allows us to make sure that we're protecting the information, we're passing it to the correct people, but it also gives us a platform to keep it, whether it be 7 to 25 years, depending on where you're operating, what the SOPs are that you're working with. And this particular, it would be a vendor, the portal can keep that information for you for as long as you need. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. And it really just reduces that risk with any PHI breach as you move forward. The second tool I wanted to talk about is about regular communication surrounding the slot allocations. Can we go to the next slide? So slot allocations and cohort management. So really getting down to the enrollment of the study. It is because you're not based off an enrollment rate, you are, and many times you have the manufacturer, right? You have to work with the manufacturer to make sure you have the slots needed so that you can get the product out to the patients. So originally when we started this, we had what we called our weekly allocation email. There's different versions of this across all different CROs, but it's really that weekly communication with the sites. So the sites always know what's going on, what's always available to them. But it also creates a relationship for whoever's sending out that email, which it usually does come from a CRO. And it says, okay, this is what's going on, but it also goes, hey, what's going on with this patient? Or I have questions on this patient. And it's also a reminder, we get really busy. I mean, having worked in a clinic, I may know I need to do something, but there are 10 other things that I need to do with that patient first. So sometimes that question doesn't get answered only because there's only so many hours in the day. So it was a touch point. So by doing that, we enrolled about 70% of our slots, which wasn't something that we wanted to be better, right? We want 100%. Realistically, it's probably a little bit less than that, although we always strive for 100%. So we started speaking with our sponsors and we're looking at solutions and pressure testing things. And so what we came up with is what we call an at-risk email. So really what this is and what it would look like in any other CRO is we identify slots that are coming up and coming. So if there's a tiered level. So let's say if it's 4 weeks away, it's yellow. If it's 3 weeks away, it's orange. And then when you go down to 2 weeks away, it's red. You can adjust that, right? It's very flexible to what the sponsor and the CRO team are comfortable with. So we identify them internally and we speak about them as a team. And then from there, we work with our sponsors to reach out to sites. And in this space, doctor-doctor conversations tend to have more patients come about, more potential patients are identified. So making sure we're working with our sponsors, because another concern we had is, okay, well, if the sponsor's speaking to the sites, the CRO's speaking to the sites, and within the CRO, you have your CTM, you have your CRA, you have your PMs. We don't want to overburden the site, because as I said before, in the clinic, there's a million things to do, just like there is for us, and we want to make sure that the communication we have is very targeted. So by doing this, we were able to coordinate with the sponsors and saying, hey, this is when you speak to them, this is when I speak to them. But we're all on the emails all the time. So we're all aware of what's going on. So by that, we had an additional contact, different levels, right? So the CRO focused on speaking with the coordinators, whereas a sponsor focused on speaking with the PIs and the sub-Is as a doctor-to-doctor conversation. There again, it can be changed depending on to what you feel is best. And this really not only helped with the recruitment, it did boost our recruitment by at least 15% of filling the slots, but it also helped that relationship with the sites, not only for the CRO, but also for the sponsor, because it's really spending that quality time together, making sure that the protocol, when you have protocol questions you can answer, And that's really what it's about, is building that relationship so we can keep working together in the future. I know there was one more tool I wanted to talk about. Jake, can I kick that over to you and talk about mock run?
I was actually going to emphasize your point here, Missy. You know, a lot of the time sponsors have a set number of slots with their manufacturing partner they have to pay for every month. So while that 70% seems like a great number, the closer to 100%, the better, because that, you know, based on this, that's 30% of costs that you are paying for that you're not using. So, and we all know how important cash flow is, especially on the past few years or so. So, yeah, I completely agree with you on this point, Missy. Amy, if you want to move over to the mock runs, I will speak to that. And just to, you know, mock logistic runs are an aspect I know many sponsors and sites are already very well versed in, but it's still an important component of training for sites, but more so for sponsors and CROs to ensure their communication pathways are ironed out. That's the most important piece to really get in line. You know, and that it's going to be applicable for both autologous and allogeneic product types. So a lot of the FACT and the JC accredited sites have well-trained staff and SOPs already in place to hit the ground running. But I think this practice becomes more important as we begin to bring on those newer community-based centers that may not be as familiar with the process and the intricacies of cell and gene therapy. But it is important to have the cell product handling manual or the pharmacy manual for products like in vivo CAR-T available for these dry runs, as well as I've worked with sponsors on developing scripts for the team to follow. And that's a really good pressure test to see how the communication pathways are set up. But you know, there will be hiccups, and we've experienced those. I'm sure Missy, you can attest to that. But it is better to identify those with each site earlier in the process rather than when you're dealing with live patient cells. We know how precious those are. And Amy, I think
I wanted to ask you a question because we know how busy the sites are, right? Missy touched on it, having come from the site. We know when we talk to them. How do you respond to occasions when a site says, it's allogeneic, I'm not sure I really need to do this dry run? Like, how would you advise anybody else to approach that scenario?
I think it takes a balance of involving the sponsor in these communications with sites. I think obviously showing them that we are a united front and kind of really doing a deep dive into why we're doing the mock run. Because like to your point, Amy, sites are busy and they're well versed in this, and they may not want to do it or have the site staff to be available for a mock run. But you know, really just stressing the importance and kind of highlighting the areas of why we want to do the mock run. And like I said, it's really about the communication pathway, because it may be different people at different times dealing with the product. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Missy, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that you're saying, Jake. When we're talking with the sites and we're doing this, it's also making sure it's as easy as possible. Sometimes they're like, oh, this is so much work, and it's bringing it back to, yeah, I get that this is a lot of work, but you know, this is, you know, an example, this is a vendor we're using. They're expecting this, this, and this, but they're going to do this, right? Laying it out so it's easy and just saying, I get this is a lot of work, and I'm doing, you know, our best to make sure that this isn't a burden on you, that this really is going to help you in the end, and not just be another thing you have to do.
Absolutely. I think I've seen some alignment crop up kind of organically when in that scenario we ask the site, great, you're busy. Who might be newer staff since the last time you did one of these, and help them understand the way we're setting up everybody at their site to succeed with that. Great points, all of it.
And I know we've had a limited amount of time today to discuss a few of the biggest operational challenges and considerations we've seen within developing CAR-T programs, but we did again want to highlight this playbook we've utilized along with our sponsors as a strong tool to reference as they begin to move their programs into the clinic. There are, of course, many more details that need to be ironed out, but you know, using this framework to generate the types of discussions that need to be had in order to be successful, we've seen that be very helpful. Amy, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it back over to you for a few additional program level challenges as we finish up here.
Well, I think that we've done a great job of capturing all of the content so far, but let's see if there are other program level challenges maybe the audience has. Ryan, I'll kick it back to you.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. At this point, I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of our webinar. Now, I've already received some questions from the audience, so we'll get ourselves started with those. Looking here, the very first question that I have for you, probably best towards Jake or even Missy, wondering, these are helpful insights. But staffing shortages at the site are another facet to the challenge with these programs. They're wondering if there's any mitigation strategies for dealing with resourcing challenges at the site.
Yeah, I can kick this one off, Jake. Yes, that's very much a matter of what we're falling into right now. There's a lot of staffing shortages. I think that there's kind of a two-prong approach that we can take here. I think the first is really talking to the site through the feasibility process. It's a great indication through startup what the rest is going to be like, right? If you're having a lot of non-responsiveness in the startup, then we know that there are more conversations that we have to have. Making sure those expectations are set and saying, hey, what can we do to help you? What's causing issues, and always offering more tools, because there's always ways to streamline things. I think the other piece is it's not used as often, but it's definitely an option that I've seen used before, is there are vendors out there that allow sites to contract a person to help them. So an example of what I've used in the past is a site didn't have the ability to enter in the data. They were incredibly behind in data, couldn't find anyone to hire in, so they came to the sponsor and to us as a CRO, and so we hired a vendor, and so they were able to enter in that data for that particular site, and it worked really well. So there are options out there that we can provide to the sites, as well as just showing a little bit of understanding and working with them as much as we possibly can.
All right, wonderful, very good. Thank you for that. The next question is wondering, Amy, is there anything that we could be doing in the treatment protocol to help make the long-term follow-up LTFU study more successful?
That's a great question. Because each one of these protocols is really busy, right? And so that's one of the hard parts about running the entire program is the busyness of each protocol. But if we start by working backwards from that day, the safe, effective treatment is market authorized, and start thinking about what do we wish we had in hand then. One thing is to, whenever possible, sort of pull forward the thinking about the long-term follow-up. We can see some efficiencies, right? When our partners are thinking about that in advance, to setting up a master protocol for the long-term follow-up, because many of them have multiple programs that they're working on. Maybe it's separate leaders for each of those clinical operations teams internally, but at a corporate level, they have multiple programs, and maybe it's the same product in different indications, a lot of different permutations of that, but it's entirely possible to really reap the benefits of efficiency by having a master protocol written thoughtfully about where to be flexible and where to be very prescriptive. And that, I think, allows it to be a compliant data collection at that stage by writing it in advance. In addition, we do find that we have somewhat better uptake of the burden relief tools that are put in place, whether it's support for travel or limited home health, when we're incorporating that into the treatment protocol and thinking ahead to how it's going to be implemented in the long-term follow-up. I think that puts people being the families who are participating, in the mindset that the long-term follow-up is achievable using the tools that they're experiencing in the treatment protocol. Hopefully that helps.
Some wonderful insight. Thank you so much. Daniel, I've gotten some great comments from people here, really appreciating your thoughts on resolving staff qualification challenges. Someone else is commenting that they think, in theory, we all agree that meeting diversity goals is important and is now a higher priority given the FDA guidance. Their question is that it seems like all the recommendations cost more time or cost more money. So they're curious, how can they be most compliant without blowing up the budget?
It's a great question. So I think first and foremost, demystifying what the guidelines soon to become requirements and law, frankly, as of January 2023, can be as simple as developing a diversity action plan that's a 1-pager or a 1.5-pager, and that you introduce very modest and cost-effective strategies in the implementation. The FDA, as I mentioned before, is going to receive that diversity action plan as part of the requirement, meeting that. So, the impact to budget and time can be minimum. However, I would challenge folks to think about the cost of not doing an effective diversity and inclusion strategy plan, the cost of not implementing and operationalizing it. They may cost two of the most expensive commodities for us, time and money. I will not sugarcoat that. Absolutely, it will take an investment of time and money. You're going to be thinking about investing on what your long-term market success is going to be. Look, this is going to be a competitive space, if not already. And so you are making an investment to your product launch so that it meets not just the FDA requirements, but that it can meet a broader demographic, and you're looking at the saturation of what your product's going to have in the market. So, I would say, again, it doesn't have to be so cost restrictive, but I would say if you're thinking about doing an effective operationalization of these strategies, it will take time investment, it will take money investment. No sugarcoating it there, but again, what would the cost be of not doing it? Either it's drug failure, product failure and efficacy, post-market requirement from the FDA with phase 4 studies. I mean, how much more dollars are you going to pour into post-market surveillance requirements by not meeting the FDA's expectations on diversity and inclusion? So, you really got to think big picture here and not, miss the forest for the trees, and really look at a robust strategy to get your product to the market.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. So another question I have here is wondering how soon should it be identified that staffing is needed at the site so that the sponsor steps in sooner than later?
Miss, yeah, good points here. Yeah.
I can volunteer for that one. I do think that it needs to be sooner. So I think a great time to kind of tease these things out, and I think that they naturally do come out to a point, is in the startup, starting with feasibility. We have an idea, but really through startup, when we're looking at resourcing in the budget, that's a great cue for me. If they're asking for more resources, or if the budget's really high, and so I go, hey, what's your breakdown of hours? That's a good cue for me of, hey, is this a resourcing constraint? And that also falls with data management, right? When we're looking at the contracts, within the contracts, we do negotiate how quickly they need to turn around, whether it be queries or entering data. And if they're really pushing back saying, hey, we need 13 days, that's when that conversation needs to happen of, hey, is it really a standard within your institution, or is this what you're only able to do? And if that's where that conversation happens, that's when we would bring the sponsor in and say, hey, this is the feedback we're getting. What do you think about bringing on this approach, whether it be a vendor or just working with a site, saying maybe capping them at a certain amount of patients, or whatever the solutions happens to be.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that very insightful answer, and everyone for all of your answers. However, we have reached the end of our time here today. Now, if we couldn't attend to your questions, know that the team at Worldwide Clinical Trials will follow up with you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. Now, I've also sent you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues so they may register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking all of our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope everyone found the webinar informative. Have a great day, and thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.